Let's be honest, we all like to think we're in the driver's seat of our own lives, right? But what if I told you that unseen social forces are constantly grabbing the wheel? Today, we're diving into the powerful psychology of group influence, and we're going to ask a really important question. How much of your mind is truly your own?
So think about it for a second. Have you ever been in a meeting, or maybe just out with friends, and you find yourself nodding along, even when a little voice in your head is screaming, "Nope, that's not right"? Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Well, that feeling, it has a name. It's called conformity, and it's basically this simple act of changing your behavior to fit in with the people around you. So in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain and investigate these incredible, invisible forces that are shaping our decisions every single day.
First up, we're going to look at some classic and, frankly, mind-blowing experiments that show just how powerful group pressure really is. And trust me, the results might just shock you. It all started with a test that looks incredibly simple. Back in the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch showed people a standard line and then 3 other lines next to it. All they had to do was say which one, A, B, or C, was the same length as the first one. Looks pretty easy, right? I mean, it's obvious. But here's the twist. Everyone else in the room was an actor, and they were all told to pick the wrong line. So imagine you're sitting there. You know the right answer, but one by one, everyone else is giving a different, clearly incorrect answer. The pressure starts to build. Do you trust your own eyes, or do you just go with the flow? The results were just wild. About 37% of the time, the real participant caved and agreed with the group's obviously wrong answer. That's more than a third of the time. It's that same kind of social pressure that makes us second-guess ourselves when we see one opinion just dominating our social media feed. Okay, so feeling pressure from your peers, that's one thing. But what happens when that pressure isn't just a vibe in the room? What happens when it's a direct order from an authority figure? Well, that's when we shift from conformity to something even more powerful, obedience. So obedience is pretty straightforward. It's when you change your behavior because someone you see as an authority tells you to. You know, like a boss, a police officer, or, in this next experiment, a scientist in a lab coat. And this brings us to one of the most famous and honestly controversial studies in the history of psychology. In the Milgram experiment, a regular person, the teacher, was told by an experimenter to give electric shocks to another person, the learner, every time they got a question wrong. Now, the learner was an actor, and the shocks weren't real, but the teacher didn't know that. The shocks got stronger and stronger, and the actor would scream in pain. The gap between what people thought would happen and what actually happened was massive. Milgram asked psychology experts to predict how many people would go all the way to the final deadly 450-volt shock. They said maybe a tiny fraction, less than 5%. The actual result? A jaw-dropping 65% of people obeyed the authority figure all the way to the very end. So what's the big lesson from these experiments? It's not that these participants were bad people, not at all. It's that the situation they were put in was so powerful that it made them act in ways that were completely surprising and, yeah, sometimes pretty disturbing. So we've seen that situations can totally make people conform and obey. But why? Why are our brains wired like this? Well, it turns out a lot of it has to do with some clever mental shortcuts we use to avoid feeling uncomfortable. And a big part of the answer is this thing called cognitive dissonance. It's that weird, cringy, uncomfortable feeling you get when you do something that doesn't line up with your beliefs. Like, you believe you should be healthy, but you just ate an entire pizza by yourself. That inner conflict you feel, that's dissonance. And our brains absolutely hate it. And to see how our brains try to solve this discomfort, let's check out another classic study. Researchers had people do the most tedious, pointless task you can imagine for a full hour. We're talking turning pegs on a board, over and over and over. Everyone agreed it was just awful. So after this boring hour, the experimenter asked them for a little favor. Could they please lie to the next participant and tell them the task was actually super fun and exciting? And here's the kicker. They paid one group $20 for the lie, which was a lot of money back then, but they only paid the other group a single dollar. Okay, so here's the big question. When the researchers later asked everyone what they really thought of that boring task, which group do you think said they enjoyed it more? The ones paid $20 or the ones paid just $1? You won't believe this. It was the $1 group. Why? Well, the $20 group had an easy excuse for lying. Hey, I did it for the money. But the $1 group?
Lying for a measly dollar made them feel terrible. So, to get rid of that uncomfortable dissonance, their brains did something incredible. They changed their own belief. They convinced themselves that, you know what? The task wasn't that bad after all. All right, so we've seen how group pressure works and how our own minds try to keep things consistent. Now let's bring it all into the real world and see how these ideas play out when we interact with other people, as friends, as foes, or even just as bystanders. This is a really important breakdown. It shows how things can escalate. It often starts with just a thought, a mental shortcut. That's a stereotype. That thought can then fuel an attitude, a negative feeling, and that's prejudice. And finally, that feeling to lead to an action, a behavior, which is discrimination. It's a dangerous path, from what we think to how we feel to what we do. And these shortcuts, they aren't just about how we see different social groups. They can pop up in the most critical moments imaginable. They can literally be the difference between life and death when we have to decide whether to help someone in an emergency. This leads us to a really chilling phenomenon called the bystander effect. Basically, the more people there are watching an emergency, the less likely it is that any single person will step up and help. Why? Because of something called a diffusion of responsibility. Everyone just assumes, oh, someone else will handle it. But here's the good news. We are not helpless against this. Psychologists have figured out 5 clear steps to break the spell. First, you have to actually notice what's happening. Second, you have to interpret it as a real emergency. Third, and this is the most important part, you have to take personal responsibility. Fourth, figure out how to help. And fifth, you have to take action. Just knowing these steps can literally save a life. So, from the subtle pressure to conform, to direct orders to obey, to our own minds just trying to avoid discomfort, these social forces are incredibly powerful. But the thing is, now they're not invisible to you anymore, and understanding how they work is the absolute first step to taking back control. Which brings us to our final question, and this one is for you. Real power isn't about just blindly following the crowd or always fighting against it. It's about making a conscious choice. So now that you can see the strings, you get to decide who or what is pulling them. How are you going to choose to play the game?